The press room in downtown Wichita was already overheated by the time the cameras began to hum. Rows of reporters leaned forward, pens poised, eyes fixed on the uniformed man at the podium. Outside, February air hung cold and metallic, seeping in each time the door swung open. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee gone stale and the ozone tang from dozens of camera lights. The police chief gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles whitening under the weight of the announcement he was about to make. He looked down at his notes once, then back up at the crowd. "We have identified and arrested the man known for over 30 years as BTK," he said. The consonants landed hard, a name both feared and obsessed over. Murmurs rippled across the room. Cameras clicked in bursts. But before he could utter the suspect's real name, the footage froze in the viewer's mind, and the scene shifted. On a long table to the chief's left, a brown evidence bag slumped under the weight of what it carried. Beside it lay a coil of yellow nylon rope, the fibers slightly frayed, and an aged post office box door, its brass surface dulled by decades of handling. A single Polaroid photograph sat under the harsh light. A woman bound tightly to a chair, her head tilted, her mouth curved in a distorted half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. The edges of the image were smudged with fingerprints that had long since lost their heat. Somewhere, in a sterile interrogation room lit by a buzzing fluorescent strip, a different voice cut in. A detective's tone was flat but edged with urgency. "Why now?" A pause, just long enough for the viewer to feel the air thicken. The reply came low, almost amused. "Because you forgot me." There was no bravado in it, no triumph, only the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting for this moment to arrive. 3 weeks earlier, long before the press ever gathered, a package had arrived at police headquarters. The mailroom clerk, used to the rhythm of envelopes and manila folders, had known something was off the moment he felt its weight. Inside was a typed letter on crisp white paper, the spacing slightly uneven, as if typed on a machine from another era. At the bottom, in a smaller font, was a line that pulled a leaden silence over the room when the detectives first read it. "Check the church basement." No explanation, no date, no address. Just that instruction, clipped and precise, left to echo in their minds. Back in the press room, the chief's gaze swept over the reporters. Some were veterans who had covered the first murders decades ago, their faces drawn with the weight of years chasing a ghost. Others were younger, learning through whispered exchanges the scope of the announcement they were witnessing. The clicking of camera shutters became a syncopated heartbeat, punctuating the stillness between the chief's sentences. He gestured toward the table of evidence without touching anything. The rope, the photograph, the post office box door, each an artifact of a long, brutal history the public only knew in fragments. No one in that room knew yet how these pieces fit together or how long they had been kept out of sight. In the corner, an assistant district attorney leaned toward a colleague. "Do we have confirmation?" she whispered. The reply was a tight nod. She sat back, folding her arms, eyes fixed on the chief as though bracing for impact. The chief took a measured breath, ready to speak the name that had been hidden for decades. But the camera in the viewer's mind turned away again, into the pale corridors of the police department where the package still sat in an evidence locker, sealed under a strip of numbered tape. Inside, the letter's words waited like a coiled spring, the kind of message that was less a clue than a summons. The crowd in the press room didn't know it, but every person standing behind the podium had spent the past 3 weeks chasing those 6 words. Officers had been in and out of churches across Sedgwick County, their boots echoing in empty sanctuaries, their flashlights sweeping across old storage rooms. Basements smelled of mildew and damp concrete, the air thick and cold, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Most turned up nothing, just stacked chairs, hymnals, boxes of donated clothes. But the team kept searching, because they understood that when BTK told you to look, it was never a casual suggestion. The press didn't hear about the near misses. They didn't know about the one church whose basement door was locked from the inside, or the maintenance worker who swore he'd heard footsteps down there at night. That knowledge stayed in the narrow circle of detectives, prosecutors, and crime scene techs, the ones who had been handed the final pieces of a puzzle that had haunted Wichita for 31 years. The chief's voice broke through again, steady, but carrying the faintest rasp of fatigue. This individual has eluded justice for decades. Today, that ends. His eyes held the kind of certainty that only comes when the evidence is unshakable, and yet behind that certainty there was something else, a trace of unease, the kind that comes from knowing the mind you've just cornered doesn't think in straight lines. Somewhere, the man they had just taken into custody was sitting in silence, the chain on his handcuffs cold against his skin. He knew the cameras were rolling. He knew the name BTK was in every newsroom in the country. And he knew there was still one thing he had given them that they didn't yet understand. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing he'd ever left behind wasn't a body. It was that letter, and what they were about to find in the church basement. In the winter of 1974, the south side of Wichita still clung to the image of a small, self-contained community. Tree-lined streets ran straight as surveyors' lines, each house standing at an equal distance from the next. That morning, a heavy layer of fog blurred the sharpness of those edges. It muted the sun and swallowed sound. The only noise on East Maynard Street was the brittle crunch of boots over a thin crust of ice that had formed overnight on the sidewalks. At 8 a.m., a neighbor noticed something unusual at the Ortega house. Curtains still drawn, no movement inside, and the family sedan parked exactly where it had been the night before. She knocked on the front door, the cold brass knocker stinging her bare knuckles. No answer. She tried again, this time pressing her ear to the wood. From inside came only a silence so deep it seemed to push back against her. By 8:20 a.m., 2 patrol officers arrived in a cruiser, their breath curling into the air as they approached. The door was locked, but a side window had been left unlatched. One officer slid it open, the rails squealing faintly, and climbed through. The smell hit first, an acrid mix of stale air and something sweet that didn't belong. It was the scent of a house where time had stopped without warning. They found the parents in the living room, both seated upright on the sofa, wrists bound neatly in front of them. The rope was looped in a pattern so deliberate it could have been part of a sailor's manual. Neither body showed signs of a struggle. The children were upstairs in separate rooms, similarly restrained. Each knot was tight, symmetrical, and cinched with a final turn that required precision and patience. The officers moved slowly, their boots barely scuffing the carpet, as though any sudden movement might shatter the stillness. There were no overturned chairs, no broken glass, no drawers pulled out in haste. Family photographs still hung evenly on the walls. The television was off, its black screen reflecting only the faint shapes of the officers' uniforms. What struck them most was the absence of chaos. This was not a crime of impulse or rage. Whoever had done this had worked methodically, controlling every variable, leaving only what he wanted to be seen. In the kitchen, the sink was dry, no dishes left out. The back door was locked from the inside. It was as if the intruder had passed through without touching anything at all, except the people. A neighbor, interviewed later that day, recalled seeing a white pickup truck parked 2 houses down around 7 a.m. She hadn't recognized it but assumed it belonged to a visiting relative. She couldn't see the driver clearly through the fog. The image she remembered most was the exhaust drifting upward and then disappearing, as though the vehicle had been idling for some time. By late morning, detectives had cordoned off the property. Evidence markers bloomed across the carpet and hardwood floors. The air inside grew warmer as more people entered, but it did nothing to dispel the chill that clung to the scene. Crime scene photographers worked in silence, their flashes bouncing off pale faces and the yellow cords binding them. One detective, a veteran of 2 decades, studied the knots closely. He noted the precision, the absence of fray, the way each end had been trimmed cleanly. This wasn't improvisation, it was skill. He didn't say it aloud, but he had the distinct sense that the knots were as important to the killer as the killings themselves. Upstairs, another officer opened a narrow closet in the parents' bedroom. The scent of cedar drifted out, mingled with the faint tang of something chemical like marker ink. Clothes hung neatly on wooden hangers. Shoes were lined up on the floor. He crouched to check the back corner and saw it, an index card propped against the wall, its edges slightly bent. On it, in looping cursive written with violet ink, were 3 words, "To be continued." The card was bagged and tagged, carried carefully down the stairs as if it might crumble under a careless touch. No one could explain why it was there or what it meant. Theories surfaced immediately. A taunt, a promise, or perhaps just a cruel way to say that this family was only part of something larger. That afternoon, the fog lifted over Wichita, revealing bare trees against a pale sky. On East Maynard Street, neighbors gathered in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones, glancing toward the Ortega house with the blinds now drawn shut. Most of them would never again think of their city as safe. And somewhere, beyond the reach of those gathering voices, the man who had stood in that living room and tied those perfect knots was already thinking about his next scene. What no one knew was that the card in the closet wasn't the only message he had left behind. In the weeks after the Ortega murders, the investigation narrowed with an almost claustrophobic focus on people who had known the family. Detectives worked through lists of relatives, colleagues, church members, anyone whose name appeared in the Ortega's daily life. Interview rooms filled with anxious faces, some pale from grief, others flushed with indignation at being suspected. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the corridors of the station as the same questions were asked over and over. Where were you that morning? Who else knew their schedule? When did you last see them alive? The working theory was simple, perhaps too simple. Crimes like this rarely came from strangers. There had been no sign of forced entry and no evidence of theft, which meant the killer had either been invited in or had access without breaking in. To the lead detectives, this pointed towards someone the Ortegas trusted. That assumption would calcify into tunnel vision, shutting out other possibilities before they had even been considered. By the spring of 1974, the active investigation was already losing momentum. Crime scene photographs were filed into thick manila folders. Reports were stacked in a back office where the hum of fluorescent lights softened the edge of the words "Unsolved Case" stamped on the covers. Leads grew cold. Witnesses forgot details. The white pickup truck sighting became less certain in memory. For 4 years, the case sat in that quiet limbo until an envelope arrived at the Wichita Eagle in 1978. The paper was standard white, the address typed neatly, the return space left blank. Inside was a letter that would drag the Ortega murders back into the public eye. The writer claimed responsibility not only for the Ortega family, but for other killings that had never been connected. His words were dispassionate, as if narrating a list of tasks completed. What gripped the detectives was the specificity. He described the exact knot patterns, the order in which the victims were bound, even the position of a toy left in one of the children's hands. These were details never released to the press. Folded inside the letter was a hand-drawn floor plan of the Ortega home. Every room was labeled. Doors and windows were marked with small arrows. A dotted line traced a path from the back door to the upstairs bedrooms, the route the killer claimed he had taken. The lines were precise, the kind of drafting that suggested both patience and familiarity with architectural layouts. The letter was forwarded to the police, and soon the FBI's behavioral science unit was consulted. But instead of triggering an urgent hunt for the author, the experts' consensus was that it might be the work of a copycat, a local seeking notoriety by exploiting a high-profile unsolved case. Without corroborating evidence linking the writer to the crime, resources were allocated elsewhere. The letter was filed, its envelope stapled to the back of the case file. It was a miscalculation that would cost years. For while the detectives on the ground felt the writer's authenticity in their gut, the weight of federal opinion tilted the scale. The case remained officially cold. The public, unaware of the letter's existence, assumed the investigation had simply stalled. The killer, watching from the shadows, had just been given the clearest sign that he could continue without immediate risk. In the basement of police headquarters, evidence from the Ortega case was stored in numbered boxes. Dust thickened on their lids, the air faintly scented with cardboard and age. The letter rested in one of them, its folded creases softening over time. No one noticed that faint traces of fingerprint powder still clung to its edges. The partial print that had been lifted was smudged, its ridges incomplete. Analysts at the time had found no match in national databases. The print card was returned to its sleeve, labeled with a suspect name that had been misspelled during data entry. That clerical error, small enough to be dismissed in a larger investigation, would bury a vital connection for decades. What the investigators didn't realize in 1978 was that the print wasn't random contamination. It matched an unsolved burglary from the year before the Ortega murders, a case dismissed as petty theft, the stolen items never recovered. The two incidents were linked not by the nature of the crime, but by the hand that had tied the knots and signed the letter. Meanwhile, in Wichita's neighborhoods, the fog of fear had lifted into something harder, more enduring: resignation. The Ortega house was sold to new owners who repainted the walls and replaced the carpet, but the floor plan remained unchanged, the same shape traced in that letter's diagram. Parents told their children not to open the door for anyone. Hardware stores reported an uptick in sales of deadbolts and chain locks, and in certain circles, whispers about the real suspect, a jealous cousin, a former co-worker, a disgruntled tenant, kept the illusion alive that the danger had passed. In truth, the danger was still moving quietly among them. The man who had walked into the Ortega home and left that card in the closet knew the police were looking in the wrong direction. He read the news, clipped articles, made notes in margins. Every day the case stayed cold was another confirmation that he could choose the timing of his next appearance. The letter remained in its box, the fingerprint card in its sleeve, the misspelled name in its database entry. It would all stay that way for 30 years, until someone noticed that the smallest detail, the one everyone else had ignored, wasn't a dead end at all. Through the 1980s, Wichita learned to live with the ghost of BTK. The name faded from headlines, whispered only in late-night conversations or in the cautious warnings parents gave their children. Locks were changed, security lights installed, but as the years passed without another killing, a thin layer of complacency settled over the city. Neighbors began to leave doors unlocked again in the daylight. Children rode their bikes beyond the end of the street. The fear was never gone, but it had been folded away into the background noise of daily life. For the families of the victims, that quiet was not relief. It was suffocating. They lived in houses where the air still seemed to hold the shape of the people who had been taken. One mother kept her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been on the last morning she'd seen her alive. The bedspread remained smoothed over, the curtains never washed, their fabric faded from years of sunlight. The room smelled faintly of dust and lavender, the way it had decades earlier when her daughter's hairbrush still sat on the dresser. She never entered without pausing in the doorway first, as if asking permission to cross a threshold that no longer belonged to the living. Detectives who had worked the Ortega case retired or moved to other assignments. The evidence boxes were pushed deeper into the storage room, each one a mute reminder of unfinished business. In the 1990s, new cases arose that bore some of the same hallmarks: restraints, deliberate staging, but DNA testing excluded the connection. The results were conclusive, but they carried no satisfaction. Each exclusion only deepened the puzzle of where BTK had gone. Some investigators believed he was dead, taken by illness or accident. Others thought he might be in prison under another name, serving time for a lesser crime. A few considered the possibility that he had simply stopped, satisfied with what he had done. But those who knew his patterns doubted that. Control had been his oxygen, and men like that did not willingly starve themselves of it. The strain of chasing a phantom took its toll. Officers spoke less about the case, not because they had forgotten, but because the constant reminder of failure weighed too heavily. Over the years, the details blurred even in their own minds. The exact shade of rope, the handwriting on the card, the layout of the Ortega home, all softened, like photographs left too long in the sun. Then, in early 2004, the quiet cracked. A plain cardboard box arrived at the front desk of the Wichita Police Department, addressed simply to Chief. The receptionist set it aside with the morning mail until a sergeant noticed the lack of a return address and the unusually precise block lettering. When the box was opened in the evidence room, the first thing they saw was a doll. It was a Barbie, dressed in a miniature nightgown, her plastic limbs bound tightly with thin cord in an elaborate series of knots. The cord was bright yellow, its texture rough against the smooth vinyl of the doll's skin. The knots were perfect, symmetrical, as if arranged for display rather than play. Beneath the doll lay a photograph. It had been taken from a distance, the grain of the zoom showing in every line. The image was of the current police chief, standing outside his home in the late afternoon, a grocery bag in one hand, his head turned slightly as if listening to something behind him. The evidence technicians worked in silence, the weight of recognition hanging in the air. The knots on the Barbie were not just similar, they were identical to those found in the Ortega house 30 years earlier. The photograph was a statement, not of threat, but of proximity. Whoever had sent the package had been close enough to the chief to watch, to frame, to record without being seen. In the corner of the evidence room, one detective leaned closer to the doll. Her eyes, blue plastic, unblinking, reflected the harsh overhead light, but there was something else. A faint seam along the right pupil, almost imperceptible unless you knew where to look. He fetched a magnifying lens, hand steady but slow, and examined it again. The seam wasn't a flaw in the molding, it was an opening. Using tweezers, he pried it back, revealing a hollow space behind the eye. Inside, tightly rolled and wrapped in clear tape, was a micro SD card. Its black surface gleamed under the light, no larger than a fingernail, yet heavy with the weight of whatever it might contain. No one spoke for several seconds. The air felt charged, as though the room itself understood the significance. This wasn't just a return. It was an invitation, a calculated move in a game the killer believed he still controlled. And somewhere in Wichita, the man who had sent it was waiting to see if the police would follow where he was now leading them. The micro SD card hidden in the Barbie's eye forced the department to reassemble its BTK task force. Among the new recruits was Detective Claire Hensley, a specialist in forensic genealogy. She was in her early 30s, sharp-eyed, with a manner that combined clinical precision and an almost unnerving calm. While others pored over the images on the card, grainy shots of backyards, empty streets, and one disturbingly close photo of a sleeping child, Hensley asked for something else, the old evidence. From the archives came boxes that hadn't been opened in years. The rope from the Ortega house was still coiled neatly in a plastic sleeve, the fibers stiff with age. Strips of silver duct tape, removed from one of the later victims, had lost their adhesive but retained faint traces of skin cells invisible to the naked eye. Hensley insisted each item be run through the latest generation of touch DNA analysis, a process far more sensitive than what existed even a decade earlier. Under the bright fluorescence of the lab, the rope was unsealed. Technicians wearing double gloves worked with tweezers and sterile scissors, removing millimeter-long fragments of fiber. The hum of machines replaced the earlier silence, punctuated by the soft clink of instruments against glass. Hours stretched into days before the results came back. There was DNA, degraded, partial, but usable, and it was enough for Hensley's next move. Upload the genetic profile to a restricted genealogy database used by law enforcement. Within hours, the system generated a list of possible relatives, none of them direct matches, but all tied by fragments of shared code passed down through generations. The list was short, just a handful of families clustered in Kansas and Oklahoma. Hensley began narrowing it down, cross-referencing names with public records, employment histories, and locations from the 1970s. One name stood out not because of anything it had done, but because of someone connected to it, a 19-year-old student at Kansas State University. The student's medical file contained a routine pap smear from the previous semester. In most cases, the tissue sample would be discarded after testing. In this case, with the appropriate warrant, the lab preserved the sample and allowed a comparison. The partial DNA from the Ortega rope aligned with half of hers. It wasn't her. It was her biological father. When Hensley read the result, she didn't smile or speak. She just set the report down on the desk and tapped her finger once against the paper, as if marking the point of no return. She knew the killer had been meticulous about avoiding DNA trails for decades. What he could never have accounted for was the existence of a technology that didn't yet exist when he began, and the possibility that his own child's medical routine could betray him. The team worked quickly to build a covert operation. Surveillance units were placed in unmarked cars along the quiet residential street where the suspect lived. It was winter again, cold enough that the exhaust from every passing vehicle hung in the air before fading into the gray sky. From a distance, the suspect's life appeared ordinary. City inspector by day, active church member on weekends, trips to the hardware store, dinners with his wife. But the watchers noted his habit of scanning the street before leaving the house, the way he locked his garage as if it contained something more than tools. The plan was simple. Kansas law allowed for trash collection from the curb without a warrant. Detectives waited for trash day, following at a discreet distance as the garbage truck stopped at the suspect's address. Within minutes, the black plastic bags were in an evidence van, their surfaces damp from melting frost. In the evidence room, the bags were opened carefully. The smell of coffee grounds, spoiled fruit, and damp paper filled the air. Investigators sorted through discarded mail, empty food wrappers, and scraps of paper. In one bag, wedged between crumpled receipts, they found it, a candy wrapper with a distinct crescent of teeth marks along one edge. The foil was slightly tacky where saliva had dried. The wrapper was swabbed. The sample rushed to the lab. The results came in just before midnight. The DNA was a full match to the partial profile from the Ortega evidence. Not a relative, not a possibility. The man they had been watching was the same one who had walked into a quiet house 30 years earlier and bound an entire family with yellow rope. Outside, under a sky clouded over with low winter light, the surveillance team remained in place, engines idling to keep warm. They were no longer watching a potential suspect. They were watching a man whose name they could now say with certainty. And inside the department, Claire Hensley was already planning the next move, knowing that once they knocked on his door, there would be no turning back. What they didn't know was that he might already be expecting them. At 6 a.m. on a gray February morning, the quiet street in Park City was sealed off by unmarked sedans. The suspect's house sat back from the road, a modest single story with beige siding, and a narrow front porch dusted with frost. From the outside, it looked like any other home in the neighborhood, a place where coffee brewed in the kitchen and a dog might bark at the mailman. But the officers watching it knew what lay inside was anything but ordinary. The man they had identified was in his late 50s, stocky, with close-cropped hair graying at the temples. On paper, he was a city compliance officer, a job that gave him access to hundreds of properties each year. In the community, he was known as a devoted church member and a former Boy Scout leader, the kind of neighbor who volunteered at safety fairs and helped fix broken mailboxes. That mask had worked for decades, because no one thought to look behind it. The arrest team moved in silence, boots crunching over the frozen ground. The battering ram hit the front door just as the first streaks of morning light bled into the sky. Inside, the suspect emerged from a back hallway in jeans and a sweatshirt, his face slack with what seemed like confusion. There was no struggle. He allowed the cuffs to be placed on his wrists without resistance, as if he had already rehearsed this moment in his mind. While he was escorted to a waiting car, the search team entered. The air inside was warm, faintly scented with old wood and machine oil. The living room held the usual clutter of everyday life: family photos, a stack of church bulletins, a half-finished crossword puzzle. But in the back of the house, behind a locked door, the atmosphere changed. In a narrow storage room lit by a single bare bulb, investigators found shelves stacked with cardboard boxes, each labeled with dates and cryptic abbreviations. The dust was thick enough to cling to their gloves. Inside the boxes were photographs, hundreds of them. Victims bound in various positions, some gagged, others staring blankly into the lens. Many of the photos had been taken in the victims' own homes, their furniture and wallpaper frozen in time around them. On a workbench sat a row of neatly coiled ropes, strips of cloth, and rolls of duct tape. Next to them was a wooden drawer filled with trinkets, jewelry, watches, a child's hair ribbon. Each item was tagged and numbered in the same meticulous handwriting. These were trophies, kept not as souvenirs but as proof, reminders that the scenes in the photographs had been real. In a locked metal file cabinet they found his journals. Each was dated and written in a steady, deliberate script. The entries described not just the acts themselves, but the planning, the surveillance, the moments before and after. He detailed the knots he tied, the lighting in the rooms, even the weather outside on the day of each murder. Interspersed were drawings, floor plans, victim sketches, imagined scenarios for killings he never committed. One journal contained something that made even the most experienced detectives pause. It described a plan from the mid-1980s to abduct a female police officer who lived alone. He had studied her habits, followed her car, noted when she left for her night shifts, but the plan ended abruptly. The final note read, "Abort. Condition unsuitable. Subject expecting child." It was the closest thing he had to a rule. He would kill without hesitation, but pregnancy had crossed some private, distorted moral line. It didn't make him human, it only made his logic more chilling. He saw himself not as a predator without limits, but as an architect of his own twisted code. Outside, the suspect sat in the back of the cruiser, his breath fogging the window. Neighbors had gathered at the edge of the street, some in coats hastily thrown over pajamas, others holding their phones aloft to record. They murmured to each other, trying to reconcile the man they knew from Sunday services with the one now surrounded by police. As the last box of evidence was carried out, the morning sun broke fully over the rooftops. The light caught on the yellow coils of rope in an evidence bag, turning them almost gold. For years, they had been tools in the hands of a man who believed he controlled the narrative. Now they were silent witnesses, ready to tell the story he had kept hidden. And deep inside one of those journals, in between pages of diagrams and dates, there was a single reference to a place the detectives had not yet searched, a location that, if real, could hold more than just memories. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and cold enough that condensation formed on the metal water pitcher in the corner. The man sat across from two detectives, his hands uncuffed but resting motionless on the table. He wore the same city-issue pullover he had been arrested in, the fabric still faintly smelling of laundry soap. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, throwing a flat, unflattering glare across his face. He didn't slouch or fidget. He leaned forward slightly, as if in a meeting, his tone calm and deliberate. When asked about the Ortega family, he didn't feign ignorance. He described the layout of their home as though reading from blueprints. He spoke of parking a few streets away, walking in under the cover of fog, and testing the door with gloved hands. He had been there before, he said, more than once, just to watch. He explained how he would pick his targets, a combination of opportunity and his own, as he called it, creative interest. Once he decided on a house, he would learn its rhythms, when the lights came on, when the garbage was taken out, when the children left for school. He favored the daylight hours for entry, when neighbors assumed any movement was just part of the normal routine. When the conversation turned to the bindings, his voice changed. It was still even, but a faint note of satisfaction crept in. He spoke of knots in the language of a craftsman, loops, tension, symmetry, the perfect knots, he called them, smiling faintly as if recalling a personal triumph. He admitted he often tied and untied the ropes at home, practicing until the movements were muscle memory. It was, in his mind, as much a part of the process as the killings themselves. The detectives let him talk, the air in the room growing heavier with each detail. They watched the way he looked past them when describing the final moments, his gaze unfocused, as though he was back in those rooms. There was no remorse in his voice, only the quiet pride of someone who had maintained control to the very end. He didn't speak of the victims as people. They were positions, arrangements, parts of a scene he had composed. A forensic psychologist observing from behind the glass noted the pattern. The killings were less about violence for its own sake and more about the exercise of absolute control. To him, the victims were living mannequins, posed and displayed in ways that satisfied an inner blueprint. Their deaths were inevitable, but they were not the point. What mattered was that every step happened exactly as he dictated. When asked if there were other victims they didn't know about, he paused for the first time. The room was silent but for the faint whir of the air vent. He leaned back, eyes half-lidded, and said almost casually, "Check the attic." It was not a metaphor. While the interview continued, a search team was dispatched back to his home. In the narrow attic space, the air was dry and sharp with the smell of insulation. A flashlight beam caught the edge of a metal tin wedged between joists. Inside were small, labeled envelopes. Each contained something that once belonged to someone else. A house key with its edges worn smooth, a lock of braided hair tied with pink ribbon, a silver keychain with initials engraved. At the bottom was a Polaroid, never before seen by law enforcement. The image showed a young woman bound in a position that matched one of his sketches. She was alive when the photo was taken, her eyes wide, mouth open as if mid-breath. The date written in the margin matched no known case file. Back in the interrogation room, they slid the photograph across the table. He looked at it briefly, then pushed it back without comment. His expression didn't change, but the smallest flicker passed through his eyes, a recognition that what he had kept hidden the longest was now in someone else's hands. It was then the detectives understood. Every knot, every photograph, every trinket was part of a catalog only he had been meant to see. And now that catalog was broken open, page by page, exposing the architecture of a mind that had built its own private museum of control. What remained unknown was whether that museum was complete, or if there were still rooms they hadn't yet found. In the weeks after his arrest, the streets of Wichita felt both lighter and heavier. For the families of the victims, there was a release in finally knowing his name, but it came tangled with the weight of what they had learned in court. They sat through hours of testimony, listening to his voice on recorded confessions, watching photographs they had never wanted to see projected on courtroom screens. Relief and grief settled side by side, each impossible to separate from the other. One mother, her hair now silver, spoke quietly outside the courthouse. She said she could sleep for the first time in decades, but her dreams were still filled with the last image she had of her daughter's room. Another family decided to leave Kansas altogether, the geography itself too saturated with memories of his presence. The trial reshaped more than just their personal lives. In its aftermath, Kansas lawmakers moved to extend the statute of limitations for certain violent crimes when DNA evidence was available. The case was cited in hearings as proof that technology could reach back across decades, but only if the law allowed it to. The change was not swift, but it was decisive, and it carried his shadow in every line of the legislation. For the community, closure was less certain. The knowledge that he had lived among them undetected for 30 years left an unease that would not fade. People remembered seeing him at church picnics, inspecting their homes in his city uniform, speaking at school safety nights. Those memories, once benign, now carried a different weight. Trust in the ordinary had been cracked. In some neighborhoods, front doors that had once stood open in the evenings were now double-locked before sunset. Hardware stores saw a rise in security system sales. Parents taught their children to notice the details of people's behavior, to question the familiar instead of accepting it without thought. The routines of safety had changed forever. He was sentenced to life in prison, his shackled walk to the transport van filmed from every angle. The footage played on loop for days, but for many in Wichita, the most enduring image was not his face, but the objects he had kept, the coils of rope, the labeled trinkets, the notebooks of diagrams. They were reminders that evil had been patient here and meticulous. Months later, the same press room where the case had first been announced was filled again. The police chief stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his voice measured. On the table beside him, inside a clear evidence bag, lay the yellow nylon rope taken from the Ortega house. Cameras flashed as he looked down at it, then back at the crowd. "This rope will never bind anyone again," he said. The words carried across the room, steady and final, but the silence that followed was not the sound of victory. It was the sound of a city, measuring the cost of knowing what had always been among them.